Hello there! In this video, I'll be showing you how to paint the awesome terrain that comes in the Scaventide box. I'll be painting just one of the larger pieces, but you can use all the same paints and techniques we'll go through on the rest of your terrain too. Each piece is packed full of detail and will look great on the battlefield for games of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. But they're also really fun and easy to paint, so let's get started. The paints we'll be using are on screen now. You can pause the video to give you more time to look, and feel free to change any of these out with different ones if you want to experiment. Here's also a list of all the brushes and extra equipment that we've used. If you're new to painting or want to brush up on your skills, check out our Painting Essentials playlist. I've undercoated my terrain piece with grey CS spray. The main brickwork of the terrain is an off-white, so this sets us up nicely for getting it done quickly. Before we have any of our base coats down, I'm going to quickly shade all the bricks of Norn oil mixed with a small amount of Lamia medium. You don't need too much. Something like 1 part Lamia medium for every 4 parts Norn oil should do the trick and help the shade better flow across those bricks and into the recesses. I'm applying this now because in the next stage I want to dry brush the bricks, and it's much easier to do that if I'm not having to avoid getting the paint onto several different base coats. You can be really messy here. Just look out for any areas where the paint is pooling too heavily. But we can get away with quite a messy look, so a little pooling is okay. Depending on how dirty you want your terrain to look, you can change the amount of Lamia medium you add. So you can see here, this side is cleaner than this side, and that's because I added a bit extra Lamia medium when painting it. With that all applied, we just need to leave it for about 40 minutes or so to dry, and then we can move on. Up next is a dry brush of Pallid Witch Flesh. Now it's really important that the shade from the previous step has completely dried before we apply this. So just take a moment to double check your terrain piece before doing this. Then once you're ready, we're going to start gently dry brushing Pallid Witch Flesh across the whole thing, focusing mainly on the bricks. This will highlight all those edges as well as also bring some colour back and make the bricks brighter overall. I'd recommend taking your time and building up the dry brush slowly, even if you want a strong effect. Dry brushing is really easy to apply, but can be quite tricky to remove. So doing it this way will mean that we get a result we're more happy with. Remember, you can always go back and add more if you want to. With that step completed, the bricks are looking awesome. Up next is the aptly named Skeleton Horde for any skeletons and bones across our terrain. So there's obvious ones like this unfortunate fellow, but there's also lots of little details hiding around, so keep your eyes peeled. There's no need to thin this down with any water, we can take it straight from the pot. Be careful when painting around those bricks we already painted, but don't worry too much about the places that still need base coating, as we'll be painting over those later anyway. Speaking of which, up next is another base coat. For all the wood, small bags and any other leather details, I'll be using Wildwood. This is a great brown contrast paint. It's nice and dark and works for lots of different textures. Feel free to switch this out with a different colour if you want to though. I'll be applying 1 coat of this straight from the pot. Looks great! Now onto some metallics. For all the silver areas, I'll be using Iron Warriors. Something like Lead Belcher would work fine here too, but Iron Warriors is just a tad darker and makes for an awesome base coat for dirty metal. I'll be applying this in a couple thin layers to all the parts I want to be silver. So this big bell, the base on the warpstone, as well as any chains and bolts. Depending on how much you thin your paint, you may find that you need to add a 3rd layer, but that's absolutely fine. Just make sure each layer is dry before adding the next one. Up next is Balthazar Gold for all the bronze areas. This is pretty much just the trim that runs along the top and the bottom of the bricks, but feel free to pick out any extra parts that you want to. When applying this, just try to be as careful as you can when painting around those white bricks we painted earlier, as well as the silver parts too. Once again, 2 thin layers should do the trick. With that done, we're going to quickly change our paint water. We want to avoid getting any metallic flakes into our other colours, and seeing as we just painted 2 large metallic areas, changing the water now is a great decision. Up next is Agrax Earthshade, and I'll be using this to shade all the gold, silver and brown areas. Basically just everything except the white bricks, which I'm avoiding as best I can. But don't worry too much if you get any of the shade onto them by mistake. These terrain pieces are meant to look quite grimy anyways, so it'll just appear like some dirt or muck. I'll be applying just 1 layer of this straight from the pot, but once you've given it a good 40 minutes or so to dry, you could add a 2nd layer to any parts you want to be even darker and even grimier. With that shade fully dry, we can see that it's made all those areas look nice and grimy, whilst also giving them some awesome definition too. Now let's move on to base coating all the warpstone parts. I'll be using Caliban Green to base coat both this big warpstone and this giant Skaven symbol as well. This is a really nice dark green colour that will set us up nicely for creating a super cool look. We once again just need to be as careful as we can not to make any mistakes. At this point, all our other areas have been shaded, so tidying them up will be a bit trickier than normal. We'll have to reapply the base coat and then shade again to cover up any mistakes. Which is obviously fine, but it'll just take a bit more time, so we want to avoid it as best we can. And there we go! I've applied 2 thin layers of Caliban green to the warp stone and icon, and now we can move on to shading them. I'll be using Norn oil straight from the pot to shade all the Caliban green. I'll just simply apply it all over, being careful around those white bricks. Once you're done, give it a good 30 minutes or so to dry, and then we can move on to the next step. Now we're going to start dry brushing all the green areas with Warpstone Glow. Double check that the shade from the previous step is completely dry first, and then once you're ready, start gently flicking your brush back and forth across both the Warpstone and the Skaven symbol. Depending on how you want it to look, you can either apply this delicately, focusing more on the green areas themselves, or you can apply this quite generously, spilling over on the surrounding areas, which will create more of a glowing effect. Both ways of doing it look great, so it's completely up to you. Alternatively to dry brushing, you could instead take some extra time to add some precise edge highlighting. If that's more your style, check out our awesome video all about painting Warpstone, where Emma will take you through it. Next up is a lighter dry brush of Moot Green. We'll be applying this in the same way and over the same areas. But this time round, I'm just going to apply a little lighter and more towards the middle of both areas. This makes it look more as though light is emanating from the middle, and also adds some neat colour variation that's a little more interesting to look at. With that done, our Skaven terrain is now battle ready. We could totally whack these down on the gaming table like this and start making battlefields for the mortal realms. But if you've got some extra time before gaming, there's just a few extra steps you can do to really take this terrain up a notch. The first being an edge highlight of Stormhost Silver for all the metallic areas. You could instead dry brush this on if edge highlighting isn't your style, or even use a combination of both methods if you'd prefer. It's completely up to you how you do it, but taking the extra time to fully highlight all the metallic areas will look really cool and is totally worth it. I used a combination of dry brushing and edge highlighting, and I think this already looks awesome. But there's actually a couple more extra steps that are super easy to apply that will make this look even cooler. So let's move on to those now. Next up is Nihilak Oxide to create some oxidation and add a great verdigris effect. Now you can use this straight from the pot if you want to, but I find that mixing this with just a tiny amount of water helps it better flow and also appear more subtle. So I'm going to be adding this to any rivets and into any recesses on the bronze areas. For recesses like this, that are more of a gradual curve rather than a harsh corner, we can actually add a little more water than normal to make the effect even more subtle. Remember, you can always go back and add more once it's dry, so building up an effect like this slowly is usually better than going straight into trying to achieve a really bold colour. It's far easier to add paint than remove it after all, but by all means approach this in any way you want to. With the oxidation added, all the bronze areas now look super cool, but we can't forget about that silver. The silver needs some weathering love too, so we're going to make some of those chains and rivets nice and rusty. To do this, I'm going to heavily thin down some Scrag Brown with water, so that's 1 part Scrag Brown to 4 parts water. Now I'm using water here rather than Lamia medium because it will dry with a slightly rougher effect, which is exactly what we want for this kind of thing. Once the mix is ready, we can start adding it to our silver areas. Try to think about where water might collect over time for a realistic look. Or check out the box art for help if you're stuck. So for me, I'm just going to be adding this to the deepest recesses that would catch the rainwater, and in between the chain links too, as I think they'd be really rusty as well. It's important to remember that less is more here and not to get too carried away. Much like the last step, if you're unsure, add less than you perhaps want to, and you can always go back and add more later. We want to build this up in thin layers anyway, so when we go back to add a second layer, we can start to think about adding it to more places if we want to. And there we are, that concludes our extra steps and our Skaven terrain is finished. It looks truly incredible now and was super fun to paint too. Hopefully you found this video useful for painting your own Skaven terrain, or maybe for painting something entirely different. Either way, I hope you've enjoyed this video as much as I have. I don't get to paint terrain all that often, so it's always different and exciting, and so rewarding too, because it'll see so much use on the gaming table. For more tutorials, tips and tricks, check out some of the other videos on the Warhammer YouTube channel, or head to your local Warhammer store, where our amazing staff are always happy to help. Thanks for watching, see you next time, bye bye!